So one of the things that we've learned and iterated upon over the years is when we had our very first class, they had assignments due every single week for all of their classes. And they were all due at 10 p.m. on Sunday. And so at 10:01, the students were done with their assignments, and they were starving because they didn't have time to eat dinner and all the rest. And so what we did was for the first couple of weeks, we provided a kind of a breakfast for dinner type event, and it was at 10:01, right downstairs. And so the students have taken this tradition, and even though we no longer have assignments for every single class every single week, those assignments are spread out, they're not done in the same day. But to this day, students all over the world take it upon themselves to have a 10:01, which means that on Sunday evening, students from a particular country cook food of that country for the entire community. And so in a given class, you have about 40 different countries represented. In a given year, you have about 30 weeks of class time. And so you actually have more countries than in a given year. And so over the course of those 4 years, you have different communities providing these Sunday evening opportunities, and it's a wonderful way for the community to come together. So one of the things, and this has now become very front and center in at least the minds of Americans, because the universities have now been exposed, at least for taking money from donors they didn't want to take money from. And therefore, all of a sudden, how universities use that money is also comes into question. The reason that this is important is, I think, threefold. Number one, universities are oftentimes nonprofits, which means that when somebody donates money to a university, it means that the taxes that the government collects are lowered. So in fact, when one person donates, everybody else who is supposed to be paying taxes effectively has to have their taxes go to other things, because that donation is removed from the tax system. So that's one broader public policy question. The second, of course, is that universities have a mission to educate. And the more that they spend money on things that aren't focused on education, the more distracted they become and defocused from that core goal of education. And the third is that universities have to project their values, right, as they create their institution. And so when a university values buildings and campuses and things like that, it basically reflects where the priority of the students and their education is, right? And so if an institution says, we focus on the education of the mind, yet 80% of the money that they spend have nothing to do with education, it makes you question, well, why do they have their budgetary priorities in that way? And so if you look at the Minerva budget, what we actually spend on, there really are two very large buckets where we allocate costs. One is the cost of being alive. You have to sleep somewhere, and so students do have to pay for a bed, and we have to provide them that bed in a building. So we are now in a residence hall in Seoul. And of course, students have to pay. And by the way, that is, when you look at it, the cost of living is the single largest cost of attending Minerva, which makes sense. We have to sleep, we have to eat, right, etc. And so that's the bulk of that, and it's half of what students spend overall in attending Minerva. It is just the cost of being alive. But the other part of the cost, the vast majority of the money that we spend is on paying their professors, teacher salaries. They pay tuition, we pay for their professors. We also have a minority of the cost paying for their support staff, right? We provide mental health counselors. We provide individuals that help them think through their careers and coaching. We provide people who live with them in the residence halls. We provide students that or staff that integrate them into the local city, provide them advising, etc. And so even though we spend less on that conglomeration than we do on professors, it's still a large chunk. And that's almost everything, right? There's very little additional overhead. We have no other buildings, we have no campuses, we take advantage of the city as our campus. Our professors work remotely, so they don't even have offices that we pay for because they work effectively from wherever they would like to work, anywhere in the world, rather than coming to a big building. And so the efficiency of what we do enables us to give the most personalized education of any elite institution in the world. But what people don't realize is that 100% of classes at Minerva have fewer than 20 students per class. There isn't a university in the United States that has that ratio. Where I went to school, the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League university, oftentimes you were in classes of 200, 300 students, sometimes 50, sometimes 80, right? The majority of classes of people that go to Ivy League universities are in large formats. And by the way, this is an important thing to understand about how these institutions use statistics to manipulate people's perspectives, right? When you're not focused on education, when you're focused on all those other things, sports programs and campuses and research programs, etc., you have to effectively lie about what you do for undergraduates. And sometimes you'll use statistics that are true, but that are misleading. So my favorite is when a university says, oh, well, you know, 80% of our classes have fewer than 20 students. And so you would think, okay, well, that's all right. I can go if 80% of my classes have fewer than 20 students, 20% have more, that's not such a big deal, right? I can deal with 20% of my classes being large, but that's not what the university says. It says 80% of the classes they offer have fewer than 20 students. 20% will have a lot more, maybe an average of 100. So if 80% of your classes have, let's say, an average of 10 students per class, and 20% of the classes have an average of 100 students per class, you as a student have to fill those 100 seats, which means that the vast majority of your classes will be in the big classes because the small classes don't have spots. And so it sounds like, oh, look at all of the small classes the university offers. Yeah, there are a few big ones. But guess what? Those big ones are the ones that you're going to be in, right? And so because of that, the nature of their education at Minerva, it's much, much more hands-on, and it's a fraction of the cost. A traditional American university, not including room and board, not including the cost of being alive, will charge about $55,000 a year in tuition and fees. We will charge about $15,000 in tuition and fees. It's a huge difference. Yes, absolutely. It's fascinating to me, actually, that of all places in Korea, we have more large companies that work with our students than smaller companies, but we also have students working in smaller companies in Korea. So for example, one of our students works with an amazing Korean startup called Standard Graphene, which is based in Busan, and worked with them over the summer. And there are a number of other smaller companies that have hired Minerva students for internships and other types of opportunities. But it's true that startups and many other countries have taken much greater advantage of Minerva students. We've had, I think, nearly 20 different startups that have hired Minerva students in Japan, despite the fact that we don't have many Japanese students, and we don't go to Japan as one of our cities. And so, but there's an enormous desire to bring Minerva students to Japan by not just Japanese companies, but also by society in general. And the fact that our students are already here means that, at least for the 4 months between September and December, every year means that there is this amazing opportunity to actually take advantage of their presence here, get their insight and their knowledge, and of course, because they're students, even though they're Minerva students, it's quite cost effective. It's not that expensive to hire Minerva students for internships, certainly compared to what they can provide in value add to companies. And so I hope that startups in Korea will gravitate more towards coming and meeting our students and hiring them and taking advantage of what they know. Well, we have, as Minerva, very close relationships with countries, governments, corporations, individuals all over the world. We've had a robust Chinese student population at Minerva, as we have a robust Korean student population, Kenyan student population, Brazilian, Vietnamese, etc., certainly American. And so I don't particularly foresee that having an impact on students coming to Minerva. We're the most globally minded school in the world, even though we're an American university and we provide an American degree. I think that oftentimes students, when they look at attending school at Minerva, they understand that it's really a global type of experience. And so we have not seen much of an impact between the friction among the two countries. Having said that, we certainly see how that effect will have damaging impact to universities throughout the United States. And by the way, not just universities. Of course, when two large economic powers fight, there's a lot of collateral damage. There's also a lot of opportunity for the rest of the world. But it's certainly not a good outcome for either China or the United States. The United States does have some visa processes that it goes through. The overwhelming majority of students that get visas to go to American universities, including Minerva, wind up getting those visas. There is always a couple of students that wind up getting entangled in visa processes. They may have something in their background that the government doesn't like, or they may not be able to demonstrate that they have enough money to be able to actually live on, etc. And so there are always those types of issues that can come up. But I don't really foresee, so if you think about it, the demand for Chinese students to study abroad is dramatic. I think China understands the value of having having Chinese students study and get degrees in the United States and come back to China with that. And the United States, not in Minerva's case, clearly, but certainly in other universities' case, generates billions of dollars of revenue from Chinese students coming and spending very large tuition numbers, $55,000 a year in many of these universities, and all of the ancillary spending that they do while living in the United States. So that would be a surprising turn of events, because unlike in a trade war where you say, okay, I'm going to tax your soybeans, and then they can say, well, I'll get soybeans somewhere else, and saying I'll tax your steel so I can produce more steel in my country. In the educational side, both sides are clearly major beneficiaries, so it's in nobody's interest to kind of break that piece. But who knows? You never know what happens in trade wars, but my hope is that it won't come to that. Well, we encourage it. We think it's a good thing. Innovation in higher education is sorely needed. And if we can be an inspiration to other people, then we've done an important part of our job. I would encourage new schools to be truly new. We've seen a few schools kind of try to pop up in various places, and you've named some of these examples. There are examples in all over the world, in Vietnam, in the United States, throughout various countries all over Africa, etc. And they create schools, and if you actually look at them, they kind of look like the old schools. And so in many regards, some of the schools that are popping up, even though they're new, aren't really that different. There's also a different kind of new school that pops up that is so radically different than traditional universities that they really aren't educational institutions anymore, right? They may be very valuable, they may be teaching very important lessons, but they're outside of the higher education system. And so there's an important place for these types of institutions. However, I believe that you can have a much bigger impact if you stay within the system and do radical reform from the inside. From the outside, it's easier to do reform. It's much easier. But the acceptance is much harder. And so I would encourage taking radical ideas and bring them inside the system, and then for those people that are inside the system to radicalize their ideas more. Sure. So one of the great problems of society is that universities that have enormous budgets therefore require a lot of money to support those budgets. And so they have a natural incentive to find very wealthy individuals and give them a university education and exclude others because there's a limited amount of spots that exist in most universities. Now, this is a problem that is to such an extent that over the past 50 years, universities have become more exclusionary than they've been in the past. Now, this sounds unthinkable, but I'll share with you a statistic from the United States, and you see these types of statistics all over the world. In 1965, if you were an adult American and you were born into the top quintile of the socioeconomic distribution, you had a 40% likelihood of having a college degree. If you were an adult American in 1965, born into the bottom quintile of the socioeconomic distribution, you had a 6% likelihood of having a college degree. So a huge disparity. And it showed that there was not as much movement as there needed to be in the United States at that time. Now, if you fast forward 50 years to 2015 and understand what has occurred in the United States in that time, 1965 was an important year because it was the beginning of the federal government providing subsidies for poor students to go to universities. It was the beginning of the loan programs for people. It was an emphasis from universities on creating need-blind admissions, so admitting without looking at parents' wealth, etc., in theory. So let's look at the results. In 2015, 50 years later, if you're an adult American and you were born in the top 20% of the economic distribution, you had an 80% likelihood of getting a college degree. So twice, 2x growth, 40 to 80%. In 2015, if you were an adult American born into the bottom quintile, you had a 9% likelihood of getting a college degree. So it only went up 50%. So with all of these efforts, with all of this focus, the disparity became worse. In fact, if you look at the Gini coefficient, which is the disparity between wealth inequality, last year was the worst Gini coefficient in history in the United States, so certainly since it started to be tracked in 1967. And so universities are perpetuating a system, not just in the United States, but all over the world, of keeping the children of rich people rich and the children of poor people poor. We find that to be morally reprehensible. And it's not enough to say, well, we have to look at all of our campus and we have to support it, we have to get money. There's no have to. You built the campus, it's a sunk cost, it's in the past. Throw it out, sell it, get rid of it, tear down the buildings, bring your tuition levels down, expand access. A society cannot exist if 52 to 55% of the students that go to Ivy League universities or Stanford come from the 1% wealthiest households in the world. Right? And so when that occurs, you create a rot in society. And so at Minerva, we refuse to do this. So not only do we charge $30,000 a year, tuition fees, room and board, compared to $70,000 in the Ivy League. In the Ivy League, where 52 to 55% of students can pay $70,000 a year, at Minerva, less than 20% of our students can afford to pay $30,000. And we do that because we level the playing field in our admissions process. Of raising money for students is extraordinarily important. Here's the problem. Why is it difficult? Minerva accepts students from all over the world. When you usually go and talk to a philanthropist, what do they say? They say, well, how many students do you have from my country? Well, any given country, we only have a few students, right? Because we don't discriminate. We find talent everywhere. And they say, well, maybe I'll support the students from my country. But we have students from 60 different countries. We can't find 60 different philanthropists, right? One from each country to support those students doesn't make sense. And so what we hope people will realize is that we are all interdependent in this world. My actions as the founder of a university impact your life in Korea. And they'll certainly impact the lives of your children, your nieces, your nephews, your loved ones in the future. Because how I designed this institution will matter to the people who graduate from it and then go to your country and work in it and make decisions halfway around the world that also impact your country. And so it is in all of our interests to find the highest potential people in the world and give them the best systematic education. But most philanthropists don't understand that. And so the current system takes money from philanthropists that should be given to the best and brightest and the most efficient way, and it's used to prop up absurd palaces for the advantage of the wealthy. And this is fundamentally the flaw in the system. So this is actually a wonderful little example, and that's because there's only one person in the world that knows what the formula for getting into Minerva is, and that's me. The way that we do our admissions process, no one knows, and every year it changes. And so if there are institutions that are telling students, we'll help you get in, they're lying to them and they're stealing their money. And so they can feel free to pay them that money, but it won't help them in the process. Because the reality is that the formula that we use is not clear. And there are many things that we ask for in the admissions process that are not part of our decision-making process. And there's a bunch of other things that are part of the decision-making process that you don't realize that we're seeing. And so it's a lovely thing to try, but it won't help. Korean students don't need to be introduced to the concept of hard work. But what helps is to work smartly. And creative thinking doesn't just happen. It doesn't happen by not working or by being lazy. But it also doesn't happen just by drilling something. It happens by actually understanding what are the component parts of creativity and then practicing them over and over again in ways that are hard and challenging and new. So if you do that, Korea will continue to be the creative leader that it's been for a long time.
I'm alive.
I am an optimistic realist.
I am exploring, founding.
I'm a changer.
I'm a Minerva student.
Eu sou aluno da Minerva.
Yo soy una estudiante de Minerva.
我是个来自密涅瓦大学的学生。
Abum unwa akukwa Minerva.
I'm a student of the world.
Are you a student of the world?